the team asked me to speak tonight on busyness, which seems fitting because one thing lockdown does do for us is it completely changes our timetables and our schedules and our whole way of measuring time and our whole way of working throughout our weeks. So this stuff may be applicable during lockdown. It may be more helpful, or it may be more helpful once we come out of lockdown, resetting our schedules and things we do. Mark's gospel, the gospel according to Mark, is a particularly busy gospel. If you study the gospel as a whole, Jesus is always on the move. He always has something to do. He always has a place to go. As you read through the gospel, so many of the different scenes and the chapters and the stories of Christ's life begin with, and then immediately. And then immediately. Jesus is always on the move, always going somewhere. And it has this quickness to it, this quickness to the journey. He never stopped for anybody. And so I want to begin with Mark's gospel tonight and to look at a couple of portions of our Lord's life given to us from Mark, and they may help us understand busyness and its place in our life a little bit more. So Jesus bursts onto the public scene later in his life with a real flurry of activity. There was a whole lot of stuff happening. And his early days, as we read in Mark's gospel, of that public ministry were really dominated by crowds and lots of things happening. He had lots of things to do and he was doing lots of things. And so I want to read firstly from Mark chapter 1. It says very early in Jesus' ministry, that evening after sunset, they brought to him all who were sick and those who were possessed by devils. The whole town came crowding round the door, and he cured many who were suffering from diseases of one kind or another. He also cast out many devils, but he would not allow them to speak because they knew who he was. In the morning, long before dawn, he got up and left the house and went off to a lonely place and prayed there. Simon and his companions set out in search of him. And when they found him, they said, "Everybody is looking for you." He answered, "Let us go elsewhere, to the neighboring country towns, so that I can preach there too, because that is why I came." And he went all through Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out devils. So we hear the whole town, and the town we're speaking about is Capernaum. The whole town came out to see Jesus. That would have placed incredible demands on his time. All these people vying for his attention. And it wasn't just the whole town came to meet him at once. It says that he individually healed many. He cast out many devils. They were placing incredible burdens on his time. He would have had to spend hours with them in order to do all of this. And so Jesus' life, as he enters Capernaum and makes his ministry public, he is busy. He's doing lots of things. And then the next morning, after a whole night of prayer, the apostles find Jesus. And Jesus has spent the whole time in prayer. And the apostles, who knows what they were doing, but they bring to him the next morning the demands of the crowd, the same crowd as the night before, the same crowd who were demanding of his time and his attention and his schedule. And the apostles sort of want to make Jesus busier. They say, "Don't you know everybody's looking for you? Don't you know everybody needs you right now? Don't you know everyone needs to see you?" And you could think that the apostles were perhaps speaking to people all night and all into the morning, people coming with their particular problems. I need to talk to Jesus for this. I need to see Jesus for him to do this for me. I need to see Jesus for him to do that for me. And so they want to add to Jesus's busyness. But Jesus, we heard in the gospel, very forcefully, very clearly, and almost with a dismissive tone, you could read it sometimes, rejects the demands of the crowd spoken through the apostles. He rejects it. And with this sort of clear-sightedness and determination, he says, I must go elsewhere. We must go elsewhere. For that's what I've come to do. What's the difference? Why two such divergent paths of action? The apostles with their thinking that the crowds need to see Jesus, he needs to be busy with them, he needs to spend time with them. But Jesus being so clear and determined to go somewhere else. The difference is Jesus had a very clear plan, which was born out of his prayer. He spent the whole night in prayer. The apostles didn't spend the whole night in prayer. And because Jesus spent the whole night in prayer, we see that his actions were motivated by the gift that he received in prayer, which is a gift of a deep and clear awareness of what the Father wanted him to do with his time. He only had so much time, but he had that gift of a deep and clear awareness of what his Father wanted him to do with that time. The apostles didn't spend the night in prayer. And not being in prayer, they showed themselves as being susceptible to being motivated by all different sorts of things, to being pulled in all different sorts of directions, perhaps the demands that others were placing on them, perhaps their own need for popularity. You know, Simon and his brother, you know, they brought Jesus there, and they would have thought, look, we've brought the next best thing around. He may even be the Messiah. And their reputation's on stake if Jesus doesn't do things for the people. You know, the apostles not spending time in prayer that night could be motivated by their own narrow plans and attitudes and ways of thinking of how they should spend their time. And so we see the difference that prayer makes. If we looked, perhaps, if Jesus lived in our day and the apostles, if we looked at the diaries of Jesus and the diary of Simon that day, the contrast in Jesus's schedule and the contrast in Simon's schedule is one was willed by God and the other wasn't. One of them had self-mastery over his time. The other was mastered. His time was mastered by other people. And so when we look at our own schedules, when we reflect on the busyness of our life, on the amount of hours we have in a week and how we spend them, and how we may be satisfied or dissatisfied in how we spend them, the primary concern and question we should have before we speak about how to cope with busyness, before we speak about techniques and spiritual practices of how to live with busyness, the more primary concern we have is we need to ask, do I need to be busy? Do I need to be as busy as I am? Is my diary born out of prayer, according to the will of the Father? Or is my diary born out of a whole lot of other, infinite number of other factors and motivations that could be going on? This is the more primary concern. And so to answer this question, we need to pray. We need to grow in our prayer life. We need to continue with the help of others to get used to listening to the voice of the Lord and following his will in our daily actions. Because if we're asking whether I need to be busy with X, Y, and Z, whatever it is, and we know that God has, a thought on it, unless we're continually trying to grow in prayer, becoming more sensitive to the inspirations of the Holy Spirit and what God wants me to do in my daily life, it's going to be very difficult to answer that question. Very difficult to answer that question. So the first thing we do is we always, it's the basis of everything we do. We need to continue to cultivate a genuine prayer life and to seek out the help we need to do that. The other thing we need to do is we need to have prayerfully a serious look at our week, or perhaps maybe our month, when we're thinking about business. When we're trying to answer that question, do I need to be busy? We need to look at our diaries. And if you don't have a diary or you don't keep one, it's not very detailed, or flicking back through it, you can't really see how you spent the last week or how you spent the last month. Maybe make the effort to keep a journal of what you do for a few weeks. So you collect a little bit of data to actually truly see how much time you're spending on certain things. Make it, if it's over the next few weeks, make it really specific. Go down to the hours, how many hours you're spending on whatever you're filling your week or your month with. And once you have that data, if you have it already, or if in a few weeks' time you've collected it, you seriously have to look at that data and say, well, what in this is necessary and what isn't? What does God see as necessary in this list of things? And what does he not see as necessary? And we can begin to grade things, their level of importance. We can begin to grade priorities, how much time, money, investment we should be putting into certain things. And once we have a clear indication of what we're spending our time on, only then do we have the freedom to start to let things go, when we see the full picture of our schedule. And when you do this, prayerfully, please God, and listening to the Holy Spirit, but practically looking at everything you're doing, don't be afraid to let things go. Don't be afraid to let things go. There will be moments, because we're used to filling up our diaries. We become attached to certain things, and we will, perhaps be confronted with the reality for the first time that this thing that I thought was so important or so vital isn't that necessary. You're going to try and hold on to that a bit. It's human nature. But don't be afraid to let that thing go. Even if you're umming and ahhing, try not to do it for a certain period of time. Say, okay, I'm not going to spend time on whatever activity this is for the next 2 weeks. And I see how my life is depreciated because of it. The other thing to do is to do this activity with somebody, to try and see and listen to the voice of God of what is necessary in your life, how busy you actually have to be, to do it with someone. Perhaps it's a spiritual director, or a really trusted friend who will be brutally honest with you and won't be soft on you, but will call you out if they have to keep you accountable, but also to help you do that, to help you see your blind spots on what you deem as necessary, but perhaps doesn't have to be part of life, doesn't have to take so much of your schedule. Obviously, when we're doing this sort of practical exercise of looking at our busyness and what's filling our life, we have to cover all of our basic responsibilities. Okay, firstly, always God, developing our relationship with him, fulfilling the primary obligations of love, the sweet obligations of love, ourself, looking at our own personal growth, our own rest, our own taking care of ourselves, and then the different grades of our relationships. So our families, perhaps if we're in an exclusive relationship with someone, our true friends. Aristotle says we can only have 2 or 3 really close friends. and then our work, and then what we're doing in the community as well. So that's it. I think that's the first point of busyness. Christ tells us, do we really have to be busy? Do I have to do what the crowd is asking me to do? Am I mastered by the crowd? Is my scheduling mastering me? Is it the master of my life? Or am I directing the show? Am I the captain with the Lord? Once we do something like this with our diary, it doesn't mean necessarily that we're never going to be busy again. Hard work is part of life, and busyness is part of life. And it doesn't mean the demands of other people will never change our plans, or our schedule should never be affected by other people, or our life should never be thrown off track a little bit by others. This sort of exercise shouldn't make us cold, calculated, timetabled people for every moment of our life that have, this rigidity that is not open in charity to others and not open in flexibility, the flexibility that certain relationships demand. But it means that we're free. And that's what we want to be. We want to be free. We want to be freely choosing how to use our time. And if we're busy, okay, that's okay. But am I freely choosing to busy myself with these sorts of responsibilities that I know God is saying are necessary? Jesus teaches us this himself in Mark's gospel again. So in chapter 1, we have the apostles saying, look, Jesus, all these people are looking for you. They need you. And Jesus says, look, no, I don't have time. We've got to go somewhere else. We've got to do something else. But then later in the gospel in chapter 6, Jesus does something different. So it says the apostles rejoined Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. And then he said to them, you must come away to some lonely place all by yourselves and rest for a while. For there were so many coming and going that the apostles had no time even to eat. So they went off in a boat to a lonely place where they could be by themselves. But people saw them going, and many could guess where. And from every town they all hurried to the place on foot, and they reached it before them. So he stepped ashore. As he stepped ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he took pity on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he set himself to teach them at some length. So here we don't see some cold, calculated, non-listening Jesus who never allows his schedule or his life to be offset by others, but he's freely choosing in each instance that this is the will of the Father right now for me to be busy with this particular thing. And he is always the master of his own time. So the key to reviewing our life and our schedule and what we do isn't necessarily to find lots of free time. It's just to work out and to move to the place of whether our diaries are our master or the Lord is our master. And that's so fundamental. So our busyness may be unnecessary because of a lack of reflection or intentionality or planning of what we're doing. But if we are constantly finding ourselves busy, it can also be a sign, an alarm, a siren perhaps, of a much deeper spiritual problem. And so it's not necessarily planning or lack of reflection, but a little bit of a spiritual condition that we can find ourselves falling into. And that's the capital sin of sloth or Achadia. And now we usually think of sloth as associated with laziness or the feeling of not really wanting to do anything, which is true, that is part of sloth. But sloth can also be manifested in not only not doing anything, but it can also be manifested in doing lots of things. So sloth is that capital sin that sees us give up on the greatness of our heavenly vocation. It sees us give up on the greatness of our heavenly vocation. St. Thomas Aquinas defines it as a particular sadness at the difficulty of a spiritual good. So we see something spiritually good, something spiritually fulfilling. The most basic of that is our relationship with God. We recognize it as good. We know it's good. We know it will fulfill us. But there's a particular apathy and sadness associated with the effort that we have to put into that. And so we begin to recoil. We begin to move away from putting any sort of effort into what is good, into developing our relationship with God and receiving his gifts. And there's a sadness associated with trying to follow God rather than a joy. And so this sadness, as I said, it's not just not wanting to follow God, not wanting to foster our relationship with him, but it's experiencing a sadness at it. And Peter Kreeft wrote brilliantly on sloth, and he said, it robs us of our appetite for God, our zest for God, our interest in our enjoyment that we find in God. And so this sadness that sloth brings about can be unbearable, because it's a sadness at rejecting the very thing we are made for. And once we start rejecting that, we're in dangerous territory. Life can be very tough. And so this sadness, moving away from wanting to follow God or wanting to put in the effort to grow in our relationship with him, can lead us to laziness, can lead us to slacking off, can lead us to a form of depression where we're not motivated by anything. But it can also lead us to do lots of things, to make ourselves busy, to forget the sadness. See, if we're sad at the effort it takes to become fulfilled, if we're sad at the effort it takes to experience God's goodness and his gifts, then we'll go looking for anything new, anything novel to excite us. In the monastic tradition, they said, if the monk in his monastic cell, in his room, was experiencing sloth, it was sort of expressed as he'd always be looking out the window, looking for something new, some sort of activity that was outside of his room. Or he would always have the desire to leave his cell, to go outside and do something else. Father Garrigou-Lagrange says it manifests itself by, we welcome any distraction that comes by, anything that will divert our awareness or our attention from the sadness that's going on, from not finding our fulfillment in God alone. We'll welcome any of it and follow any of it. And so we can fill our lives. The danger is we can fill our lives with all these different things that distract us from the deep sadness of not pursuing God. So we have no God, and so we try and fill him with one thing, try and fill the hole that his absence leaves. We try and fill that with one thing, and obviously it doesn't work. And so then we try and fill it with another thing, and that doesn't work. And we try and fill it with another thing, and that doesn't work. And before we know it, we've filled our week with all these activities trying to divert us from the very one thing that will fulfill us, which is the effort in following God. And so you can see, we can do that. Classically, we can do that with pleasures. We can do that with money. We can make all these things into false idols that take the place of God. But all the great spiritual masters say we can do it with activities. We can make activities our idols. And the busyness that comes from it, we try and cover over the sadness and fill the hole that God's absence leaves in our hearts. Peter Kreeft says, we avoid God's absence as much as we avoid his presence. We don't want to think about his absence when it comes over us. So we turn these activities into our idols. Reflecting on some of this, we can see not just within ourselves, but we can see how deeply sick and how deeply poor our civilization is. You know, inventions of the last 50 to 60 years, devices have given the promise of more time, have given the promise of more leisure, of freeing us for greater things. But rather than giving us more time or giving us more leisure, they simply give us more time to fill with other distractions. And it turns into somewhat of a vicious cycle. And so after quite a few decades now of really advanced time-saving devices and technology, why aren't we less busy? Why aren't we less busy? It's most probably because the increase in technology hasn't been driven by a desire just for more time so we can spend it on better things. But the increase in technology has been driven by this slothful cycle of freeing more time to make even more distractions. I'm not saying all technology is bad, but it's sort of like the advances in technology over the last few decades have hit a chord and have worked well with our civilization's spiritual sickness. That it's a perfect sort of antidote to fill your time when you don't want to think about not knowing God and the absence and the sadness that leaves in our life. Once again, quoting Peter Kreeft, he speaks about technology really fueling sloth in our society and not making us more free for leisure, but actually making us busy. And he says it's because our society as a whole has forgotten how to answer the three basic questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going? And the answer to all of those questions is God. And because we've forgotten God, technology has perfectly placed itself in history to be able to distract us from the fact that we can't answer those questions anymore. And it's part of this vicious cycle of deflecting from those questions. So we need, as I said, to have a very practical look at our life and ask ourselves prayerfully with God, do I need to be busy as I am? Do I need to be busy? And the other thing we need to do, you know, with the help of someone, a good spiritual guide and friends, to look and see, okay, perhaps if I can't overcome this plight of busyness, that I can't sort of schedule my life, it always seems to be busy, and I can't get out of the cycle of busyness, is there a deeper spiritual thing that needs to be healed in me? Is this perhaps signs of sloth? I'm not saying we're completely slothful or will be slothful forever, but is there some sloth active in my life that needs to be healed by Christ? The great spiritual masters and the newer spiritual authors give some different ways forward that aren't perfect solutions. You know, they're not like you pop a pill and the problem will go away. The solutions require effort themselves as well, just like anything good requires effort. But there's a few ways out of trying to live a more simplified, more determined, more intentional life with God being the master of our diary. The first is developing that rule of life. As I said before, with a friend who's going to be honest with you, or with a spiritual director who can keep us accountable, and the friend who will keep us accountable. Now, I'm not saying, you know, we don't have to develop the spiritual rule of life that maps out every hour of our day for the 7 days of the week. But we, at the very least, we have to have a couple of pillars throughout our day that are regular, that keep us on track, that we're not being completely swept up with our surroundings, but we're very clear that these are my priorities that are immovable, and the rest of my life revolves around them. That's at the very minimum. But then etching out time throughout our week, using it well, covering all those priorities in our relationships with God, with ourselves, with family, with friends, with our work, with whatever we're doing in the community. One of the ways, if we discover that sloth is perhaps feeding our busyness and getting us to just throw ourselves in activities without thinking about it and sort of being addicted to doing lots of things, one of the ways to cure sloth is to let ourselves feel, the spiritual masters say, let ourselves feel our hunger for God, and don't try and fill it with anything else. Get used to feeling unsatisfied. It's okay. It's human to feel unsatisfied, because it reminds us of our need for God, that only God can truly satisfy our hearts, to be comfortable with the restlessness of our hearts, and to not immediately fill it, but to hunger and thirst, to experience that hunger and thirst for God. Some of the spiritual masters, like John Cassian, they even say, even in the best, greatest, good experiences of life, even to learn in those moments to say, this is nothing compared to heaven. That even this is unsatisfactory. Even if I think it's the best thing I can experience this side of heaven, to always maintain that hunger, even in the best times. The other thing to do is to really continue to thank God for the precious gift of time. Gratefulness changes so many things in our outlook in life, but it will really help us see our time as precious. Not to look back on the time we've wasted and to bash ourselves up about it, but to really acknowledge that I don't have a lot of time, that it's a precious treasure. And I don't know how much time I have as well. I can't presume or assume I have X amount of time. I only have a small amount of time given to me by God to grow in union with Him and to serve others. But most of all, to cure, if it's a spiritual illness that's leading us to busyness, is really the simplest answer is to experience the love of God. And that's done through prayer, obviously through the sacraments, but to be able to answer those questions again. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? The love of God is the answer to all of those questions. And to not find our identity in all the things that I do, to not find satisfaction in all the things that I do, to not measure the success or the fruitfulness or the faithfulness of my life in all these different things that I do, but to have all of that, our identity, our success, so to speak, or our self-worth, all of that firmly grounded in the love of God, and to have those roots into the love of God sinking deeply, more deeply every day. And as I said, that's not, a quick little thing we can do one day that completely changes our life, but it's something we continue to be faithful to. We have to put in the effort and grow and hear the words of love that God has for us and experience that love over and over again. And the more we do that, the less need we'll have to fill our lives with activities, to fill our lives with the idols that are activities, and to be just content with doing what God wants us to do and not running after the infinite other possibilities that the world wants us to fill our diaries with.